leadership conversation on the distance reactive tendency of the leadership circle profile. I say this every time, but it couldn't be more true. Our world needs creative leadership. And we at Leadership Circle know that coaches and leaders like you are in the best position possible to provide that, whether that's through your own leadership or in the way that you guide others to grow into theirs. With our Surfacing Creative Leadership series, we're hosting an ongoing conversation to unpack, demystify, and surface insights within the dimensions of the LCP, one dimension at a time. Today, we're exploring distance, which reflects a leader's tendency to establish a sense of personal worth and security through withdrawal, being superior, or remaining aloof, emotionally distant, or above it all. To get us started, we'd love to hear from you. How does distance show up in you or in your leadership? Feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. And while you're doing that, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our featured coaches today, Jamie Kelly and Amy Gibson. Jamie Kelly is an executive coach and leadership development consultant whose work is grounded in simple but powerful beliefs, particularly that the right question can change everything. With more than 20 years of experience in coaching, organizational development, employee engagement, and culture, she helps leaders navigate change, uncover new possibilities, and prepare for what's next. Known for thoughtful curiosity and insightful questions, obviously, Jamie helps clients deepen their self-awareness, expand their perspective, and move forward with greater confidence and purpose. Amy Gibson is also an executive coach and a consultant and former management consulting executive with more than 20 years of experience helping leaders grow into greater leadership responsibility. Drawing on expertise in adult development, organizational change, and mindfulness, she creates the space that leaders need to build that self-awareness, to navigate complexity, and to lead with confidence. Often described as both an anchor and a catalyst, Amy helps leaders trust their strengths, expand their perspective, and step into new challenges with clarity, courage, and purpose. Whew, I couldn't imagine two more leadership circle-y coaches than these two. Jamie and Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Surfacing Creative Leadership.
Thanks. Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get started with the basics when it comes to distance. When you are working with clients, when you're debriefing or coaching and working with leaders, how does distance come up? How do you introduce them to this dimension?
Yeah, I can get started and then Amy jump into usually kind of taking a look at what it usually looks like in others, right? Like a little bit like a Teflon, like things like slide right off me. I'm going to deflect that kind of thing. Staying guarded. To your point, when you're talking about emotionally distanced and hard to get to know or aloof, which is always hard to read, right? So sometimes we make assumptions based on somebody being quieter or aloof, and we read things into it that really aren't there. So kind of opening the conversation for why might that be your perspective of yourself or their perspective of you? Anything else, Amy?
Yeah. Actually, the chat's been really fun. We clearly have folks joining us who have really coached around this space. Often it's about I might see it in feeling I need to be superior or feeling I need to be the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it can show in that way. Sometimes in terms of leadership, these dimensions, it might be having a low courageous authenticity. It might be sort of the opposite of what's on top, that where we might be working in that space and then distance comes up. So we can see it in a lot of different ways. As someone said here, Matt's talking about like, I'm not willing to be vulnerable. It's very difficult, or that's not a skill I have. That's not a tool I've been using as a leader. So it can show up in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I know Amy and I were talking about this the other day. I had a client once who did this as part of a bigger program and checked in with him to see how it was going, not in the coaching capacity, just passing in the hall. And he said, I love my walls. I've spent a lot of time building these walls up around me. You're trying to make me break these things down. Like, I don't know about this, right? And he was open to it, but he said that's how I've felt like I protected myself this whole time, right? And he's like, I spent a lot of time building them just to get these knocked down. I'm not sure it's going to take some time, which is fair, right, to think through, especially if somebody doesn't normally kind of step into that distance. To kind of understand where they're coming from is helpful.
Distance always seems to me like one of those dimensions on the profile that could be kind of dismissed or overlooked, or it's like we all know the word distance. It's not a new concept. So I feel like maybe it's just me, but I feel like we can bring a lot of assumptions to it. Is there anything about this dimension that seems to surprise leaders when you're discussing it or bringing it up, or that maybe it's not just about kind of being naturally quiet or needing solitude, but about something else?
I think it's interesting sometimes how people see it as that form of protection. So I think sometimes those who kind of dive a little bit more into distance kind of don't see why it might be a negative in some points. And it does help, like Amy had mentioned before, to flip it into the reverse of it's kind of robbing that ability to have people see that courageous authenticity. If we're keeping them at an arm's length physically, right, then we're kind of blocking who we are and keeping ourselves from engaging with that person or that team. So yeah, I think sometimes people are surprised that anybody would want to know more about them. I think there's some cultural, there's some cultural norms to that too, right? Of like, I'm going to leave home at home and work's at work, and they don't intermix. I'm not going to get too deep on anything. It's just about the work. But yeah, a lot of times I've been burned. I'm not, fool me once, but I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to fall for that again. I'm just going to keep my distance all the way because I don't want to get burned again.
We've also talked about some professions where they would be rewarded, or it's what they need to have. Maybe they're a psychiatrist, or we were talking about it. Jamie, I think you shared who was that gentleman we were talking about?
The gentleman with the walls. He worked in physical security, right?
That's what security.
That the walls make sense to him. That's what keeps people out, and that was his line of work. So he saw it as a natural, and kind of didn't see the flip side to it.
I had a client who was really surprised. She saw herself as being a really awesome listener, and came off as strong distance. So that was a real shock to her, and understanding what's the difference. How do I? That was a real perception gap for her and her team.
I want to jump back to something you just said a minute ago, Jamie, about cultural norms. And actually someone I think in the chat also mentioned this too. How might the cultural context, whether that's where a person grew up or the kind of family norms of their community, or a team norms or an industry norms, how might that affect a leader's distance or shaping a leader's distance? And how do you navigate those kind of different dynamics when you're coaching leaders?
Yeah, I think one of the most important shifts is for them to understand that that's not everyone else's norms, right? And so what you feel protects you might look like something else to someone else. Also, Amy and I talked about the other day, the implications of maybe being an only or one of the few when it comes to race or gender or age. They want to withdraw and hold back because they don't want to reveal themselves too much or stand out too much. So they'd rather withdraw and be distant. Not everybody, but sometimes it's a component of that helps them feel more safe in certain circumstances. But I do think there's some certain jobs that lend themselves more towards this feeling more natural than others, I think.
I think in terms of the culture piece, I love this question, and we did talk about it, is helping maybe maybe think about the self-awareness around it. Is it in being intentional? If it's really an intentional, this is how I want to show up in the world. And I will figure out a different way to be, some others leadership skills in order to be effective. Or is it not a behavior that I don't understand, or I don't understand the impacts of it, or how I'm perceived? How does this help perceive? So I'm not necessarily inclined to say like distance is always bad necessarily. I think a lot of it is being aware of how you're showing up in the space, what that perception is, what the impact is, if there's a cost to it. If not, what does that look like, and put in that some context for them, and then they can decide, what they want to do with it and how they want to show up.
Sometimes I think it's a function of they might not trust themselves to open themselves up. Sometimes it's a function of trusting others, but sometimes it's a function of, I don't know if I trust myself to dive in too deep with these people, with this team, with this company, and I might not be willing to stick my neck out, or not again. If I've done it before.
Jamie, I think you're actually just hitting on something that Matt's asking in the chat, which is, what is it, or what might you perceive to be the connection between distance and a preference for introversion, for being an introvert?
Right. I think it's the focus on the why, and if it's a element of shyness or just not wanting to share too much, are there other ways through actions and behaviors they're sharing, if it's not through conversation, that the remaining aloof makes the person just a little bit harder to read, where they might not be giving up some of that body language to let you know where it's coming from. But it might be as a form of that introversion, and I prefer to be an introvert, so I prefer to just stay quiet, stay in the corner. As a leader, it's thinking about what are the implications of that, though. A lot of great leaders who are introverts.
Yeah, for sure. And so what else can we look at as a way to build those relationships, bring that vulnerability, work on those relationships, if, being the first person to speak, or really bringing a big energy into the space is not your jam? There's other ways that how else can we look at this? And what are the implications, and what are other opportunities we have?
Because if it's part of being an introvert, courageous authenticity is stepping into who you really are. And if you really are an introvert, then that is part of it, right? Like it's not working against that, but it's like, so working with it. And what are some other ways that make it comfortable to show up, instead of diving all the way opposite out of distance?
I don't know that you've either said this explicitly, but you're both touching on something I think is really valuable and important that comes up every time we talk about a reactive tendency, which is that, just because it's reactive doesn't make it bad, right? And that there are lots of reasons and good reasons and situations in which, this reactive tendency can be a strength or can be what's needed. And so I just wanted to say that out loud, because I think you're hitting that chord, and it's something that we see come up with every reactive tendency. And it's always an important point.
And I hear on a lot of the other calls with the reactive tendencies too, people say, which I write down and I have it at the ready all the time, at what cost, right? You can absolutely be a strong leader and still be somewhat distant, but at what cost? So what's suffering because of that? Or what are we missing out on as an opportunity to expand our leadership and our authenticity by holding back in distance?
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. And I think too, it's about intentionality. And am I holding back in the situation because for a reason, and there's intentionality behind it? I understand why I'm doing it. And I have a plan around that, or a strategy around that, or I'm just doing it because I'm not aware. Those are two different things. So I think for every reactive tendency, there's situations we can all come up with that make sense why a leader would show up in that way. And what does it look like? Do we have the skills not to show up that way? Or is this so really the intentionality and the awareness and self-awareness of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And is it making sense? Is it getting me where I want? Is it working for me? Is it not? What do I want to do? But again, to your point, there's always reasons why any of those reactive tendencies make sense in certain situations, or certain jobs, certain roles.
Well, okay. I do you want us to move on for a minute? Because I think we've got a good basis of what we're talking about when we're talking about distance. And so utilizing distance then as an entry point for discovery during a debrief or during coaching conversations, or just to even help get leaders curious about their profiles. When you see a profile and distance stands out for whatever reason, it's high, it's low, there's a big gap for whatever reason, what might that tell you? Or does that tell you anything right off the bat? Or does that start any questions going in your mind about, oh, I want to ask about this, or I want to find out what this leader thinks about this or does in this situation? How does that serve, or how might that serve as an entry point into a debrief or a coaching conversation?
I don't, maybe if you've got something you can chime in first.
I would say, assuming that this is a place they want to start, I don't normally, so let's say that they are curious about it. So then we would go there. I think I would get curious around and are there certain areas I might go into the different graphs and say, are there certain areas where you're seen as aloof? Is this a whole thing? Is this how you're always showing up? That's kind of where I would get curious. Are there certain areas, or are you curious? Are you aloof being seen with your peers or your whatever? Like I would get curious around, the extent of the behavior, the extent of the perception that folks have. I would be wildly curious what they think of it. What if, let's say, someone's high? How do you read this? And oftentimes I'll go back to the actual questions, because to really someone, and this is what folks, this is how they rated you or whatever. This is the questions that were asked. How do you feel about that? What would that look like for you? I think also as we sort of process through that, like I said before, I might get curious on what is integrity and curious authenticity, courageous authenticity look like. Also, is there a kind of play? Someone else in the chat said, is there a play between that and passivity, or is it that's a whole section? Like, really putting into context, I guess is what I'm saying. I would be really curious. So can we put this into context and see what the client's really interested in and what meaning they're making of it?
And in the data, when you look at the breakdown between the different types of raters and how they rated the distance, is that consistent or is it inconsistent? Is another good place to start. But yeah, kind of like those leading questions as you get into the debrief anyway, just learning more about the history of how they came into leadership, some of their past work history. The area of work will kind of start to tell you a little bit more about maybe why they find some value in still remaining distant a bit.
So, Jamie, the consistency piece is an interesting one. When you're talking about the different kind of evaluators, you're talking about like peers versus direct reports versus, and so what might that tell you if those ratings are not consistent or are consistent? Which would either way what that might that tell you?
So if it's more the direct reports see them as more distant, but say their peers or superiors or the people they report to don't, then maybe they lean more towards that authority, and that they're open with, but they feel like they need to not be a friend but be a boss to their team, and they've kind of got that contradiction for themselves. Or sometimes we'll see it where they're actually much closer with their team and they've built their little kingdom, and then the rest of the folks I'm not going to open up to, but my people know they can count on me because I'll be open with them, but we'll stay kind of guarded from the rest of the company a little bit.
Got it.
Yeah, that managing up piece, maybe they're not managing up well, or they're only managing up well. And there in that, and there's an inconsistency in how they're seen.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I think the second part of that consistency piece is what may be a gap between their own perception and the evaluator's perception, right? So if sometimes the way we see ourselves can wildly vary from how other people see us. If you see that there is a big gap, or what might that tell you?
Yeah, I think that they're comfortable opening up with certain people and not the others, right? And why? And there's the kind of digging deeper into, what's the cost of that and where's the safety in that? And kind of what would that shift away look like, shifting out of distance.
Yeah, I'd be really curious about what identities do they hold, that maybe this is what history do they have? Someone mentioned trauma. What, especially if it's really off, if they think they're really showing up fully, and they're not being perceived as showing up fully, that could feel like a pretty big gap, and really trying to understand, maybe literally it might get really like, how are you literally, what are you saying in meetings? How are you showing up in meetings? How are you hosting one-on-ones? What do those sound like and look like? You might get a little tactical on, you believe you're showing up this way, you're being seen as this way. There's, really get curious about that gap and maybe get real technical about it.
Diving into some of the comments too on the open-ended questions, there might be some clues as to how that's showing up, or what what implications that might have on their leadership.
I love that. I always forget that there are open-ended questions. Focus so much on what the survey is like and forget that there are other questions. One of the things we found really interesting and useful to talk about when we talk about the dimensions is how they show up in our body, right? This idea of, are we leaning forward for part of our conversation? Are we crossing our arms? Are we scowling? Different things like that. When you think about distance and all the different ways that it can show up in behavior, what are maybe some ways that a leader might recognize that tendency or that pattern, or feel themselves starting to go toward reactive distance, and by noticing how it feels in the body?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you see a lot of leaning back and a lot of crossed arms, or even pushed back from a table, like in a meeting, a camera off in a meeting. Those are exciting. Not that that's why people are doing it now, but you know what I mean? Those are some that I think of right away. Or just, the kind of holding back to speak. I worked with someone once before that always hold back to speak, let other people speak. And then when she spoke, she just repeated kind of what they said. Again, to like, I'm not going to give you my personal answer. I'll just kind of ditto a little bit of what was said, instead of really like, no, I want to hear from you. What does this mean to you? Those are the ones I think of right off the bat.
I have someone come to mind who was a senior leader and wouldn't sit at the table. They would sit at a chair on the outside of the table, even though they had the role and really should have been at the table. And there was a lot underneath that. And some of it, I think, was this. There was a bit of a superiority thing, which is really an interesting way of not sitting at the head of the table. He kind of took a very opposite view of it. And it was a power play he played, but there was some distance he was trying to play there, and he definitely was perceived as being very distant in those roles, in his role.
Olga in the chat has just kind of seconded the comment that came up earlier, asking about that connection between distance and passive, which you brought up just a minute ago. And it's kind of a perfect segue too, because I know we have a sample profile to pull up, but one of the things that's really helpful is to look at those relationships between dimensions. You've already called out sort of the across the profile relationship with courageous authenticity and integrity, and we know that there's a neighbor relationship with passive. Like, can you talk maybe or dig into that maybe a little bit more?
Well, hopefully I have my data right, but if I looked at it right, the most negative correlation to creative is passive, and the second most is distance. So if I was looking at that correctly, that those can have to partner together, or if they have both of those, can be a very strong correlation against kind of those creative tendencies. I feel like passive is kind of, whatever you guys say, like, that's fine. It's more like giving in, where distance is not even entering the chat. I don't know. That's kind of how I see the two, a little bit different. But yeah, all on that people side, but used maybe in an unproductive way. I could be wrong in this. The people that I've worked with before, the clients that I've worked with before, that were more in distance weren't doing it to save space in a relationship and not push back. It was just all the way out as a barrier and a protective kind of layer between them and the folks.
I'm actually going to ask Jamie a question. One of our colleagues in the chat asked earlier, do we think it's harder to coach someone who's high in distance? I'm curious what you think, Jamie.
I personally do, and we have a good example of it coming up in a minute. Because what we're trying to do is break down some walls and get them to open up. And if the thing this one is an extreme profile, but if one of the things that they don't prefer to do is do that, it's going to just take more time. And at the same time, I guess it kind of depends on where the client came from too. If they sought out coaching for themselves, that's one thing. If they happens a lot, it's part of a program, so they have it. They may not have been the most willing participant in that mix, and they wouldn't have been looking for that feedback for themselves. That can take a little bit more time. So yeah, I think that's a bigger factor, but distance in and of itself, if they like to keep private or quiet, I think it's deliberative. In the Clifton Strengths world, same kind of thing. You start asking too much and they're kind of whoa, hang on. Why are we talking about that? They kind of get, there's kind of a, not defensive, but just kind of a barrier putting up, I think, a little bit. I don't know. Have you had that experience, Amy, about it being harder to coach someone with distance?
I haven't coached too many folks that are strong in distance, but I can imagine, I guess, yes. If they're, again, I like your idea of it kind of depends on how they come to coaching. If they're trying to be open to the idea of learning how to be more open, that's one thing. If their self-awareness around it is pretty low, I can imagine that would be really challenging.
Yeah. Good point.
Well, Jamie, let's look at this really tough case of yours, if that's okay.
Sure.
That's a good one.
My AirPods keep slowly dying, of course. Let me share it real quick.
We can shout if you need it.
Yeah, I'm good now. I think we're both working. It's the dreaded, you hear your ear. Oh, detergent. Yeah, so here's an example. This is a client of mine that I coached. So in full transparency, she took this as a part of a program where it was part of a program that everyone went through. She didn't seek this out necessarily for herself. A higher level female leader inside of a company or somewhere that she's worked for a long time. I'm curious, before I start talking about it, what do you all see? So if people wouldn't mind putting in the chat, what do you notice first about anything of this profile, not just the distance part necessarily?
I mean, I know what I noticed first, but I'm kind of looking for it. So it's a little bit of a tough.
Yeah. We've got task focused with a high protection and low on relationships, high reactive and distance, very low relating, very low on the creative relationship tendencies. It can't be high integrity if no one knows what you think.
Yeah, she thought that.
A way of imagining, yeah. Big gap on integrity.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. How close their evaluation is to the evaluators, absolutely. And I printed off some of that data. So it was 17 evaluators, and overall the 17 together were in the 95th percentile for how they scored her. But that's actually a 2.81. So it's kind of between that seldom and sometimes. It's not like they give her 5 for it or anything, but comparative to the database, that's quite high. And her own self-score was a 3.61. So even higher in that realm, which compared to other self-scores was in the 97th percentile. And it was really consistent across the board. Boss was a lower percentile in the 61st percentile, but the rest were, the boss probably knows her a little bit better too. Um, yeah, but that was one of the key things, is that she matched that with the distance, right? That was not a surprise for her that other people felt that. That huge gap in integrity was really interesting. I think that helped her start to see, that at what cost? It's at the cost of integrity. So people weren't sure, not maybe that they thought she wasn't, didn't have integrity, but they didn't feel as confident about that because she was hard to get to know in that way. But yeah, you guys are all correct. Very task oriented. This is a leader whose job is very focused on data. And that probably doesn't surprise you. And you see that lower score for relating. That's not really a function of her job, though she is a leader and a leader of leaders as well. That wasn't something that has been as high of a value, but you notice her scores, except for a couple, is that interpersonal intelligence, her scores really were very close to theirs across the board. So very self-aware. Didn't surprise her to see the distance. They rated her a bit higher on critical and arrogance than she had. But I also kind of summarized a few other comments. And, some of the comments about her was she's very highly respected, very analytical, very strategic minded, a trusted expert, a reliable executor. Some said effective communicator. So the interesting thing there is, I think that a lot of the folks that rated her know what they get when they get her. Like they know what to expect. Actually, I've done a lot of work with this woman, and she's phenomenal. But it doesn't make her the most relational person, which is difficult from a leadership perspective, but technically great. So some of the primary opportunities for growth, people said, is a little bit more in relationship building, becoming more approachable. I think that's something we haven't necessarily talked about with distance. Providing a little bit more context behind decisions. Because without that, if you're staying kind of distance from some of that, it's like, well, that's what we decided, that's what we're moving forward with, and kind of not feeling the need to explain this herself or the decision being made. Maybe not the most empowering person for focused on development and coaching of her folks.
So Jamie, is it fair to ask or say, Francisco and I had a similar question. So was this intentional? She said she's very self-aware. So was she intentionally, for these behaviors that were consistently intentional about being aloof or some of those pieces?
So. I think a lot of it is self-preservation. This was on the cusp about 3 years past a pretty big trust breakdown within a peer of hers and her, and some things that led to some dismissals and things. Also, there was something in her personal life that had really rocked the trust and kind of some of that personal relationships that were going on. And so I think it was kind of a defense mechanism a little bit, and I can stay safer if. Now, not having a previous one done before those big changes, like 10 years ago or so, it's hard to know, was this always how she operated, or has this been kind of more exacerbated with some of these issues that have recently come up? But definitely more on that task, extremely intelligent about the task and the data and the details, which is what's rewarded in that position. And then you hit that level of leadership, and especially at hers, leading leaders, and it's like, oh, but also we have to have this relationship side, and that's extra important when you're the leader of the people.
So I'm curious. Yeah. So since she was very self-aware, she knew how she would show up. If you recall, I don't know how long ago you worked with this client, but do you recall what meaning she took of this, or where she focused?
I think that is a growth area. I do think that there's been some things she focused on, goal related to get to know her own team and peers a little bit better and focus on some of that relating category. The problem is, without that consistent focus, that rubber band just snaps right back, right? To like, yeah, but I'm most comfortable in the technical data details, task side of things. So it's one to continually focus on. I don't know that she shared much with her leader about this, which is, given that this is, I doubt it, which is difficult because when there's not somebody else there helping champion that for you, or now we'll start doing some pulse surveys. So I'll be able to tell when people pick their one big thing goal, like kind of continually within your accountability circle, how are people seeing that change the way they view leadership without having that in the beginning with us 3 years ago. It's a little tough to see if there's been some progress. I would say no. I would say I think I can't remember if we talked about it away before or not, but what's getting rewarded when you live in that distance, and if that pain of change isn't bigger than, or isn't smaller than the pain of staying the same, and it's kind of like I'd rather stay where I'm at. I feel pretty good being guarded, which is tough. Again, I would be more shocked if somebody like this sought coaching for that exact purpose. Usually it's kind of like, I'll do this because it's part of it, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
What a tough position to find yourself in as a coach, and like working with leaders who are doing a program who are not necessarily on board with being coached or becoming self-aware. That's got to be really tough.
And at least it's an opening to get that started. The tough thing with this one in particular, and I kind of read to you in that summary, like pages of glowing comments.
Yeah.
So it's also hard to find the why that she'd want to change, because people respect her for her work and always know that she'll get the thing done and that she knows the systems and the data inside and out. And that makes you a great technical expert, maybe not the greatest in people leadership. Yeah.
So would this get in the way of any potential promotions that she was looking, this meaning how she's showing up? Was there a risk of this getting in the way, how she's showing up in a way of any further growth or promotion opportunity at the company?
It could. I don't think that's of interest of her, and I don't think that's of interest I think that's an easy, like, she's not on that path. She's kind of where she wants to be. Has it caused some people to leave that work for her? Yes, from what I understand. They don't get the nurturing, the coaching and mentoring and that kind of thing. And that's been difficult for direct reports.
That really hits at the heart of that question of like what it might cost, right?
Yeah.
That's a great insight.
Because also sometimes what you'll find, and this person would be a good example of that, is she's fantastic with the technical details, the data, the ins and outs of every single system. But when you're not bringing other people along, or she's gone for a few months, I don't know that people, you can't be the only point of contact on things. Growing and developing your people to make them capable as well is so important. And I don't know that I would say that she overtly doesn't do that to protect her own self and her job. I don't feel like it's a sense of that, but that could be an underlying reason that it just hasn't surfaced. But I think it's more of, I like to be the expert in this, and I'm good with being the expert, but we need to grow some other experts as well. And that shift in that leadership pipeline, kind of that shift to leading others, and especially leading others who lead others, is a little more difficult when there's not that relating piece that's strong.
I want to be cognizant of time. We've got about 17 minutes left until the top of the hour, and I want to make sure we have a good chance for Q&A. So I might move us to just maybe the next couple of questions, thinking about like brass tacks and some tactics. You've talked about them in various places already today, and it doesn't have to be about this person that you were just sharing with us, Jamie. But thinking more generally, if a leader if they do want to work on their distance, if they're happy to be coached and they want to work on their distance, what are maybe one or two small, high impact practices that you could encourage them to start experimenting with?
I'll take one and then pass it over to Amy. I would say, like for this person in general, like finding one or two people to start with and building that relationship on that relating side of mentoring and developing. You have great system awareness and tactical knowledge. Who can you bring along with you, and helping show the value in that? You don't have to be open to everyone all the time, but where can we kind of make a little crack in that distance and kind of bring some things together a little bit? And I think I'd lean on that through the relating and having her help coach and mentor other people.
Yeah, awesome. Just in addition to that, or just taking a different idea, then would be maybe thinking about, is there a group of people, a team or a meeting group or somewhere where she can, I'm going to say she, but for this person can show up a little bit more courageously? And what could that look like? Are there small, it won't feel small probably, but are there behaviors that maybe this person could practice in maybe a relatively low risk environment to start to see what it could look like to show some vulnerability or ask a question they don't already know the answer to? Or what are some of those things that we can start to try to show up a little bit, maybe to be seen as a little bit more real or a little bit more, I don't know if this person might show up as really polished, just so show a little edge. But really, what are some maybe low risk areas? Sometimes I do, when someone's really, really not sure, really uncomfortable with trying something new, is maybe outside of work. Maybe you sit on a leadership team for a volunteer. Maybe you volunteer in a certain situation, or maybe you work at your kid's school, or maybe is there a place outside of work that we could play with some things, play with some behaviors, try some new things, and see what that looks like and what I can learn there, and then bring that back into the office. If really at work isn't safe or doesn't feel comfortable, what would that look like? I think the other thing I will say here too is, based on, if we go back to that piece of maybe I'm very intentional, there's an identity I hold and it is not safe. I do not feel safe in this environment to really show up in this way. If the person wants to, is there a way in which is there a community I can get involved with it at work? And is there a way in that way I can start to show up a little more fully, or, challenge some of this behavior that I've, either taught myself or so that would be another idea of where can we find those places where we can start playing in this space and showing up a little bit more fully. And this is where I think this would take time. For sure. This might not be a quick hit, a quick win.
I think it'd be great to start by asking them, like, who are you? If you envision yourself shifting away from this distance, then who are you? What would that feel like? Where would you feel it? What's the cost, or what's the risk, and what's the benefit, to try and kind of find that tipping point for them to start to make those small behaviors changes.
I really love that. And I'm not sure I actually need to ask this next question, but I'll just put it out there because I think, Amy, you mentioned, or the one that really caught my attention was, like, what's a question I can ask, in a meeting or something, to put myself out there a little bit more. And my question was around maybe like micro actions that might interrupt the fall back on the reactive pattern. So if I'm catching myself pushing away from the table at the meeting or something, or if I'm catching myself like wanting to be distant, what's something that can help interrupt that? And I love that idea of even just reminding myself, like, we'll ask a question. Are there maybe other little things that are tips or little, I hesitate to use the word hack, but like little things that can help interrupt that behavior?
I'd say the physicality of leaning in, right? Sitting up and leaning in and leaning forward. Some of those things we do, to me, I have to sit on my hands to not talk, because I'm going to talk with my hands. Like there's things we've learned as our own workarounds, right? If I need to keep quiet, I have to do that. So maybe it's the opposite of that, like having more open body posture and leaning forward and starting by asking a question versus sharing, can start to at least show the interest and get that conversation going.
Yeah, I like Sophie's comment about breathing more fully and really showing up in the space. A client just now came to mind that I'm working with currently, and she wants to show up bigger in meetings. She just got a big promotion. She actually jumped a level, and so has a lot of imposter syndrome and do I deserve to be here? A lot of that language. And one of the things that she came up with, or we sort of co-created together, was in one of the meetings, there's one woman in that meeting that is an absolute champion for her. And so what my client decided to do was sit across the table so that when she wanted to ask a question, she would ask it to that champion, to this woman and so she looked at her, and this woman nodded to, and we talked about this ahead of time. This was a plant, this was a seed. This woman knew, hey, this is my goal. This is what I'm trying to do in this space. And so as she just actually quite quickly, I will tell you quite quickly, as soon as she did that once or twice, it became much easier for her to ask questions in that meeting and show up more. So that was an interesting way that she found a friend and elicited that person to really help her show up more fully in these meetings.
I love that.
Okay, I want to get to some of these questions that have come in. Here's one. I view managers and leaders as being two different things. I don't think that once you're a manager, you automatically become a leader. How do you handle a siloed manager that demands respect and loyalty when they don't model this?
So not necessarily having to do with distance, or they are showing up.
I think maybe just when they're not modeling those things, and maybe respect and loyalty being a familiarity or a vulnerability. And so the distance compounds that. That's how I read that question.
I could imagine thinking that a lot of different directions, maybe just right off the cuff, and we can certainly chat through this, but I guess it kind of comes back to you, are they aware and that loyalty and respect are important to them? I might have them define those things. What's important? What does that look like to you? How would you know if someone is loyal and if it was loyal and respect? And really dig into what those are, those beliefs, what they look like, how they show, how they know that. And then maybe start asking, how do you show up? If those are things that you care about, how do you show up in those ways? And maybe trying to bring some awareness, help them gain some awareness around that and how they show up and, how might others perceive, do you believe, or how might others perceive your loyalty and how you show up? So just getting curious about how they identify those things, what are important to them, how that represents, how people demonstrate those things, and then maybe bring it around to them.
Yeah, and that distinction between managing and leading, and certainly this isn't the only way that looks, but if we kind of maybe helping to distinguish between maybe looking at managing as processes and programs and tasks, where leading is more about the people, and that's not the only distinction, and you can also manage people, I suppose, but looking at it that way to show how important both sides of that are, and it's not just about the tasks. And we see a lot of profiles that are very task heavy, right? They're not as balanced, but starting to see the value in the other side, finding out who's done that for them in the past and what's that looked like or felt like. Where's that helped you along your journey to kind of find that way to want to give back to others and lead them in a similar way.
Okay, here's another one. What are some things, maybe what's one of the first things that might change or might be visible when a leader begins reducing their reactive distance? So I'm thinking,
how might someone know?
Yeah, like how do they know? Oh, I'm succeeding. This is working, or the things that there is a shift happening.
Themselves, the person know themselves?
Yeah, or how will others notice it? I mean, I think either. It's a broad question, but I would imagine a leader wants to know themselves if they're actually making progress on a goal they've set.
Yeah, it's interesting because my first thought was, how will others notice? And I can see them seeing that leader sharing something of themselves that's maybe personal or something, not deeply personal, but something more than they would have normally or shown an interest in another person, and how that might kind of look like kind of a little bit of a break in that distance. But would the leader themselves notice it?
Mm.
I don't know. Is it
I
with like
guess,
other people
like,
being more open back with you?
yeah,
Maybe.
that's where I was headed. Jamie, was they might see that they're learning more about their employees. They might all of a sudden be like, wow, I feel like I know my team better. We feel like we're gelling more, and that's because folks are more comfortable speaking in front of them. Maybe they go into a meeting, and where they would have just started the meeting and got into write the task, maybe there's more banter or chat and chatting, and they're more comfortable chatting around this person and the person and welcoming that person, this leader, into the fold of that sort of chatting. I would guess that I would the comfort level of those around me would probably be where I would see it, if I were paying attention.
Back to what you were talking about before, Sarah, with those micro actions. I mean, you just mentioned one, right? If in the meetings you start with a point of connection and just kind of an open question that's about just something fun, or whatever it is, to kind of, not even lighten the mood, but just kind of keep the openness to the conversation before we go into the content of the agenda, I think would be a good micro behavior to start to change, to see how that can kind of play out and set this tone for people to be just a little bit more open before you dive into the work itself.
Jamie, I fear you're talking about the dreaded icebreaker question.
Well, they can be fun ones too.
Oh, I've used those 100 times myself. I'm fully on board.
We've been referring to it on my team as the fun question.
Fun question.
About each weekly meeting. But yeah, sometimes I'm sure they're a little bit more fun than others, but which I think is something that a leader might find that they start incorporating, and then they'll really know it's starting to take hold of other people on the team that report to them on the team, start bringing a question as well. They're invested and they want to, I've got a question for next week, and then they bring one themselves rather than the leader having to drive that.
I love it. And actually, you're hitting on this. We've got time for maybe one more question. And so just talking a little bit about the impact of reactive distance and of reducing that reactive distance on teams, like on your actual team and team culture. Can you maybe speak a little bit to that? What happens when a leader is maybe reactive distant or strong distant? What happens with their team?
I would imagine working for a leader who is strong in distance would, I could imagine it being difficult to maybe take risks or step outside my own comfort zone, or if I'm not sure if I'm not getting a lot of feedback, I'm not getting a lot of interaction. Maybe to flip that, as that softens, and maybe that courageous authenticity or integrity starts to get stronger, you might see the team really perform at a higher level. I'm going to bring you up. I'm more comfortable bringing new ideas, and maybe more comfortable admitting to a mistake or a failure. I'm maybe more comfortable showing up more fully. So I would guess over time you would see the performance of a team really rise. That's what I would hope, as people get more comfortable and more willing to really show up fully in that space.
I think you'd see kind of an increased sense of belonging, that there's somebody who supports me and I support them. So I feel like we belong together a little bit more, which I think opens up more lines of communication for collaboration, both within a team or amongst other teams, because you don't want to build it for just your silo either. Build that kingdom of just those folks, but breathe that outside and away from that team as well, which I think can really help expand kind of their awareness of what's going on beyond just their team.
I love it. Well, excellent. We are at 2 minutes to the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to wrap us up. I think that about does it for us today. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Jamie, for joining us. Thank you, all of you who have stuck around and asked some great questions and had an excellent chat. I invite you to join us next month. We're going to surface insights in the integrity creative competency. Came up a lot today, so it might be a really good twofer if you join us next month too. We'll be joined by coaches Luis Fernando Valderrama and Andre Montoya. You can sign up for that or register for that session right now at the link that I think is going to be in the chat or is already in the chat. Or be sure to watch your inbox and Leadership Circle social media for details and for other Surfacing Creative Leadership announcements. We're now, on behalf of our fantastic guests, Jamie and Amy, I am Sarah Stahl saying thank you so much again for your time and attention today. Take care, and we will see you next time.